The Democratic Party is the oldest active political party in the world. But since 2016, the Dems have been soul-searching. Are they a moderate, liberal party, or are they a progressive, left-wing party that wants to change the status quo? Actually, I just lied. This debate has been raging at the heart of the Dems for decades now, and it ties into an important question. What exactly are the Democrats? When it comes to Western countries, where should we place them? Are they on the left side of the aisle, the middle, or even the conservative side? I constantly see people online say that Joe Biden and even Bernie Sanders would be conservative in Europe. So, is that true? Let's actually look at the data. This is what, why, how, and that's what the video is about. If you like this sort of thing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out patreon.com/whatwhyhow for early access to future videos, and to keep the channel alive. Okay, there are, of course, hundreds of different political parties in the Western world, and they've wrestled over a million different political issues. I could talk about women's reproductive rights, or support for Israel, or support for Ukraine. If I really wanted to make the Democrats look good, I could include a bunch of Eastern European countries. But instead, I want to focus on the two European countries that come most to mind to Americans when I say Europe: Britain and France. I also want to focus on three important political questions to Americans: immigration, the corporate tax, and healthcare. These are important issues to Americans, but they're also proxies for a bunch of other important social and economic issues. So first, let's talk about immigration. I think it would be fair to classify efforts to make immigration and naturalization easier as left-wing, and the opposite as right-wing. So let's look at the Dems. On their 2024 platform, the Democrats make it clear they want to 1. Secure the border, 2. Treat immigrants fairly and humanely, and 3. Expand legal immigration. There is a tiny paragraph that says, those who pose a threat to public safety or national security must be identified and removed as quickly as possible, which is of course dwarfed by the much larger priority the Republican Party places on that issue. In fact, the Dems specifically say legislation must support a pathway for long-term undocumented individuals to become citizens. The Democrats also began to implement these policies under President Joe Biden. While people online like to pretend the Democrats were secretly just as conservative as Trump when it comes to immigration, this obviously isn't true when you look at the actual facts. People online might look at this chart of deportations, returns, and expulsions and say, look, they were higher under Biden than under Trump. But actually, Biden's deportations were 1. A response to COVID-19, and 2. Actually smaller than Trump's when you look at real deportations, not just turning people away at the border. The COVID-19 stuff there, well, that's referring to Title 42, and those were at the border and consisted of a lot of repeat encounters. So basically turning people away, and then they would come back and try again, and then they would be turned away, so on and so forth. So that's the Democrat position. How does that compare to Labour Party, the largest left-of-centre party in the UK? Well, conveniently, Labour published a big old manifesto in 2024, complete with Keir Starmer himself trying to look very serious. While Labour recognizes the contributions made by immigrants, it says, under the Conservatives, our economy has become overly dependent on workers from abroad to fill skills shortages. The overall level must be properly controlled and managed, so Labour will reduce net migration. On the next page it says, we will end the long-term reliance on overseas workers in some parts of the economy by bringing in workforce and training plans for sectors such as health and social care and construction. Like the Dems, Labour has a section on secure borders. It has what you'd expect from a center-left party, complete with recognition of how nice it is to accept refugees, with the inevitable but. Labour will set up a new returns and enforcement unit with an additional 1,000 staff to fast-track removals to safe countries for people who do not have the right to stay here. But what has Keir Starmer actually done as Prime Minister? Well, he's actually increased deportations and wants to increase them more. Critics even say that many of those labeled foreign national offenders have lived in the UK for most of their lives and have a legitimate right to be here. So, while the Dems turn people away at the border but want more pathways for legal immigration, Labour wants to decrease immigration. I think it would be fair and honest to categorize the Democrats' position on immigration as a bit more left-wing at least than Labour. But let's sail across the channel and look at France. President Emmanuel Macron is the honorary president of Renaissance, which I think you could fairly categorize as a centrist party on the French political axis. Renaissance is the largest party of Ensemble, an alliance of other similar liberal centrist parties. In 2024, their website declared, "We will continue to expel from the country any foreign national who is a criminal or radicalized and poses a threat to public order. Since 2017, we've expelled nearly 12,000 such individuals. The issuance of any long-term residence permit will be conditional upon proficiency in French and respect for Republican values. Otherwise, the prefects may revoke the residence permit. Thanks to the European reform of asylum law, we will open detention centers at Europe's external borders to examine the situation of migrants before they arrive on our soil." Well, clearly there is a different emphasis than the Democrats. Most of that is pretty similar to the Democratic policy, except for a few bits. One is opening detention centers at Europe's external borders before they arrive on our soil, which sounds a bit like Donald Trump's Remain in Mexico policy, which the Democratic Party opposes. Except obviously Macron's party is referring to European Union law, and the European Union's external borders are, still the borders of the European Union. There's actually a whole interesting debate to be had about externalizing the asylum process in the EU, but since that gets into weird EU versus national law stuff, I don't think it would be fair to compare that to America, which of course is a country and not a international union. So why don't we look at what Macron has actually done? Well, a few years ago, France's Jupiter championed a new law that toughened the government's response to immigration. Most of it isn't too far from the Democratic Party, except again, the introduction of a French language proficiency requirement for multi-year residence permit holders, which I mentioned before. For reference, the United States does not have any language requirement for green card applicants. We even have English language exemptions for gaining citizenship. So, like Labor, Ensemble is a bit more conservative than the Democrats when it comes to immigration. Obviously, France has different local circumstances than America, but I think we should interpret those circumstances as explanations and not excuses. But if the Democrats are a little bit more left-wing than Ensemble, what about all the other parties in France? France has like 100 different parties. What does France's left-wing alliance, the New Popular Front, have to say about immigration? Well, they want to repeal Macron's immigration laws. They want to facilitate access to visas and create legal and secure immigration pathways. They also want to guarantee access to state medical aid to undocumented migrants. That is farther left than the Democrats. Democrats have made it pretty clear that they don't want to provide health insurance to undocumented immigrants. So pretty clearly, the Democrats are a bit more left-wing than Labor and Ensemble, but more conservative than the New Popular Front on the issue of immigration. What about the corporate tax? I think it would be fair to talk about efforts to raise the corporate tax as left-wing, and efforts to lower the corporate tax as right-wing. On the 2024 Democratic Party platform, the Democrats declared, Trump slashed the corporate tax rate to 21%, down from 35%. President Biden will raise that rate back to 28%. And for those billion-dollar tax dodgers, the president signed a historic 15% corporate minimum tax into law. This isn't just in the platform, but also in Biden's proposed budgets. But since the President of the United States can't rule by decree yet, the United States did not actually raise its corporate tax rate from 21%. The Labor Party spends much of its platform talking about cooperation between the unions, the government, and the private sector. Things like business has for too long been hampered by a government that does not work with it. There's some actual substance on page 31. Labor will cap corporation tax at the current level of 25%, the lowest in the G7. That might sound similar to the United States, but in America we have a flat tax rate, so all companies get charged 21%. Joe Biden's proposal for a 28% tax rate was also, it seems, a flat tax, whereas the UK's policy is 25% for all companies making over £25,000 a year. Okay, so pretty clearly, the Democratic proposal is a bit more left-wing than Labor on the issue of the corporate tax. In France, the corporate tax is 25% for all companies. That 2024 Ensemble pamphlet did not specifically address corporate taxes, but it's worth pointing out that the 25% rate was a product of Macron's policy of lowering corporate taxes from 33% a few years ago. Now, of course, recently France's parliament has extended a corporate income tax surcharge on the largest companies. So since 25% with a little surcharge is less than 28%, I think it's fair to categorize the Democrats as a little bit more left-wing than Ensemble and the other parties that make up France's governing coalition. But what about the other parties in France? Did they support Macron raising a little bit of a tax surcharge? Here's what an article says. The government's amendment was adopted thanks to support from the left and the center, while LR, that's the Republicans, and Macron-aligned MPs remained divided, and the far right and Horizons, which are center-right, voted against it. So we can kind of see the political alignment of French parties there. Now, the New Popular Front in France doesn't seem to have said much about the corporate tax rate, but La France Insoumise, another left-wing party, has. In their proposed 2026 budget, they say they opposed Macron's corporate tax cut to 25% and want to raise it back up, presumably to somewhere around 33%, but they don't say specifically. But they do want to impose a bunch more taxes the Democrats probably wouldn't support. So the Democrats are a bit more left-wing than Labour and Macron on corporate taxes, but not as left-wing as France's actual left-wing parties. What about one of the most important issues for Americans? Healthcare. I think it would be fair to categorize efforts to expand public insurance or public healthcare service as left-wing, and the opposite as right-wing. But the United States has what we call a mixed system. Of the roughly 6,000 hospitals in the country, there are roughly 1,000 public, government-owned hospitals, and the rest are private hospitals, mostly but obviously not completely, not-for-profit hospitals. Back in 2008, so the data might be a little bit outdated, but that's the best we have, public hospitals cared for about 14% of patients in the country, so not very much. But how do Americans pay for this healthcare? Of the 92% of Americans that have insurance, 2/3 get private insurance, and 1/3 get public insurance through government programs like Medicare if you're old, or Medicaid if you have a thin wallet. About 1% of Americans get care through Veterans Affairs, which includes government-run VA hospitals. Back in 2009, Democrats tried to get another government-run insurance option for Americans, but they were blocked by Republicans and a couple moderate Democrats, so Obamacare is watered down. Since then, Democrats have occasionally made big public stance for public options. Joe Biden said he wanted a public option back in 2020, but apparently forgot about that. Meanwhile, half of House Democrats want Medicare for All, which is another public health insurance program, but half haven't signed on to that. Importantly, nothing about a public option or Medicare for All was in the 2024 platform. Instead, they said, "We support Medicaid expansion, encouraging states to provide health coverage to low-income Americans on the federal government's tab." So this is an example of an issue the Democrats are divided on. If you're familiar with this issue, you probably can see where I'm going with this. Because other countries in Europe have very different systems. The United Kingdom has a national health service available with no charge to British citizens. Not only that, but the NHS is administered technically by the government. So the NHS isn't like Medicare for All, it's more like America's Veterans Health Administration for All. There are, of course, some exceptions. British adults have to pay a bit at the dentist, for example. And also, 1 in 8 people get private insurance anyways because of flaws and weaknesses in the NHS system. But you get my point. The status quo in the UK would be a radical left-wing proposal in America today. For comparison, 87% of healthcare in Britain was delivered by the NHS, so that's literally the inverse situation as the United States. Not only that, but the political parties in Britain like the NHS. Labour says in its 2024 manifesto, "The 1945 Labour government founded our National Health Service on principles that have stood the test of time. The best health services should be available free for all. Money should no longer be the passport to the best treatment. People should get the best that modern science has to offer." Labour also wants to expand and strengthen the NHS. What about the Conservatives? Well, they love the NHS too. They say we will continue to increase NHS spending above inflation in each year of the next parliament. Even Margaret Thatcher reluctantly kept the NHS alive. What about France? Well, France also has universal health coverage. There's some private health insurance to cover the gaps, since vision and dental care are minimally covered. Also, while there are about an equal number of public and private hospitals, it seems about 2/3 of treatment is provided by public hospitals in France. So less than the UK, but multiple times greater than the United States. So this is another example of a European country with a much farther left-wing starting line than the United States. What do the parties think, though? Let's look at Emmanuel Macron's Ensemble, which again is a centrist party in the French political scale. Today, far too many retirees, students, self-employed individuals, and job seekers still lack health insurance. For these 3 million French people currently without coverage, we will create a public health insurance plan for €1 per day. It will take the form of an expansion of the existing universal health coverage program. This will be a new right for millions of French citizens. But France also does have conservative parties. What do they say? France has a Democratic Party, but they also have a Republican Party, funny enough. The Republicans are France's largest center-right party. On their 40-page PDF of policy proposals, they mostly talk about cutting social programs, but not really France's healthcare program. In their separate proposals for fixing that system, they don't mention cutting or privatization, just the usual sort of pragmatic proposals that can't really be graded on American political axis. Okay, so the Republicans were not really that helpful. What about France's growing far-right party, National Rally? Well, they also don't want to move away from France's healthcare system. Instead, they want to cut bureaucracy and provide greater funding to hospitals. In their 2024 legislative program, they say their main focus in the health system should be to restore confidence in public hospitals by providing them with the resources to be effective and by reforming their governance. In their 2022 presidential election program, they say they want to spend 20 billion euros to stop the closure of beds in public hospitals, increase the salaries of healthcare workers, and so on. So what are we to make of all of this? Well, on an absolute level, democratic healthcare proposals are not as left-wing as what parties in France or the UK want. In fact, they're a bit more conservative than what conservative parties want. But on a relative level, compared to the status quo that exists in these countries, democratic proposals to expand public insurance kind of align with what the center-left in France and the UK want. I think it's a bit smaller scale for some Democrats and larger scale for other Democrats. So which should we pay attention to, though? The absolute scale or the relative scale? Let's think of an imaginary situation to help clear our minds. The People's Republic of Hawistan has been communist for 80 years. All industry is owned by the government on behalf of the proletariat. The new Hawistan Reform Party comes to power. It wants to privatize 25% of all government-owned industries, so they want to sell government ownership of a quarter of all hospitals, rail lines, so on. Is this a communist party, a liberal party, or a conservative party? Next door to Hawistan is the Federation of Watia, which has been capitalist for 80 years. All industry is privately owned, but a new party wins power, the Watia People's Party. This party wants the government to take control of 25% of all the privately owned industries in the country, so federalizing 25% of the oil industry, the mining industry, so on. Is this a communist party, a liberal party, or a conservative party? And which party is more right-wing? The Watia People's Party, so the second party I talked about, or the first party, the Hawistan Reform Party? I pose the same question to you guys, my viewers, and most of you think the first party that wants to privatize industry is more right-wing than the party that wants to socialize industry, even though they have different proposals, 25% private, 75% public versus 25% public and 75% private. So relative direction is more important than absolute destination. Now let's connect this back to the subject of the video. Europe is different than America. The Democrats aren't running for election in France or the UK, they're running for election in America, a different type of country with a different starting line. For whatever reason, socialist parties had more success in Europe in the past, so they've implemented socialist programs that have become part of the status quo. So when a European party doesn't want to abolish their country's strong social programs, but the Democrats want to expand America's weak social programs, I think we should probably view the Democrats as at least a little bit more left-wing than that European party. Because the modern-day Democratic Party can't change the past. But I honestly think that if the United States already had some sort of European-style socialist healthcare system passed by FDR 80 years ago, I think Joe Biden and other Democrats would support it. Just the same as Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron support their country's socialist healthcare systems, and just the same as modern-day Democrats support past social programs. Just listen to how they talk about them. In 1935, we passed Social Security. In 1965, we signed Medicare and Medicaid into law. These are more than government programs. They're a promise that we've made as a country, that after a lifetime of hard work, people deserve to retire with dignity and security. They've made tens of millions of lives better. This is basically identical language to how Labor talks about the NHS. So how should we categorize the Democratic Party? I think the most boring answer is probably true. The Democrats are a center to center-left party, comparable to Labor or Ensemble. They're a big party, so some Democrats are more moderate, some might even be classified as conservative, but others are pretty progressive. So no, Joe Biden wouldn't be far-right in Europe, Bernie Sanders wouldn't be center-right in Europe, because they're not in Europe. They're in America, which has a much farther right starting line than Britain or France. Next time you see someone saying something like that, send them this video. And if you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe and support the channel on patreon.com/whatwhyhow for early access to the next one for just $1 a month. Thanks to those who already support the channel, and adios.